Yeah, welcome back to the channel, and today we discuss the human eye. Now we're not going to cover the entirety of the human eye, just some parts, right? But before we can start with the human eye, there are a few very important terminologies to be aware of. First of all is the idea of reflection and the idea of refraction. We need to be able to understand and differentiate between these two words. Now, reflection simply refers to when light does not go through an object, but rather that it bounces off of the object. I will make some drawings to try and make these points, right? So, reflection, light does not go past a particular object, it is reflected back, it bounces off of that object. But when we talk of refraction, light is able to pass through that object, but as it passes through that object, it is going to bend due to a change in speed. So it approaches the object at a particular speed, but as it passes through that particular object, it will either speed up or slow down. And as a consequence of speeding up or slowing down, then that light is going to change directions, right? Now, let's try to explain the idea of reflection. Let's say we have got an object. Let's call this object A. And we have got light coming in an angle, so coming downwards to our object here. Now, because object A is going to reflect this light, the light will not be able to pass through this object and appear behind it. It will rather bounce off of that object and it will change directions. So we refer to this phenomena as reflection. So it is reflected. When it is reflected, the light will change directions, right? Let's talk about refraction. And let's say this is object B. If object B is capable of refracting light, let's say the light is coming from the same direction, so from bottom upwards. Because this object can refract light, the angle through which this light approaches this object is going to change as it refracts in this object. So it is going to change direction. You'll find that it may change its angle to now go in this way. And we call this phenomena refraction. So in this instance, light was able to pass through object B. But in object A, light was not able to pass through. It was reflected back. And the classic example of reflection is the use of a mirror when you are in the sun. So if you are able to hold a mirror in the sun, you are able to reflect the light towards someone who's maybe sitting in a shade or in another room. You are able to reflect that light towards them, and we call that reflection. But when the light is able to pass through, we call this refraction, right? So these are very important terminologies to be able to understand. This is reflection and this is refraction. Now we're going to focus a lot on the idea of refraction, and it is important to note again, light will approach at a particular angle, but as a result of refraction, it will change the angle through which it approached as it passes the object which is transparent, because it will allow this light to pass through. So as it passes through, the angle through which it approached is also going to change. So we call this refraction, right? Now, let's talk about the human eye. Now, the human eye is said to consist of 3 layers. The 3 layers, namely, are the sclera, the choroid, and the retina. The sclera is said to be the outermost of the 3 layers. The choroid is in the middle, and the retina is the innermost layer of the eye. So it is these 3 layers: the sclera, the choroid, and the retina. Now we're going to focus on different parts that are found in the sclera, choroid, and the retina respectively. And there is a lot of structures to go through and also state their function, but we'll try to go through as many as we possibly can. Now, let's try to label the individual parts that are in this structure. the other parts that are not labeled will fill them in, right? Now, let's start with structure B. Structure B is what we call the cornea. Structure B is what we call the cornea. We'll simply state the names first and then we'll go into the functions. So structure B is referred to as the cornea. Structure A is what is referred to as the iris. Structure C is the middle layer of the eye, so we refer to this part as the choroid. Structure D shows a part of the retina that is known as the yellow spot. It is known as the yellow spot. And then structure E shows what is called the optic nerve. It shows what is called the optic nerve. So let's try to fill in the parts that are not labeled here. So we're going to have the part directly in front of the optic nerve, and we're going to label that part F. And part F is what is known as the blind spot. Now, immediately in front of the blind spot, we've got this empty part. It is actually filled with a fluid. And the name of the fluid in question, it is known as the vitreous humor. It is known as the vitreous humor. Now, behind the vitreous humor, in this layer right here, this is the innermost layer of the eye. We call it the retina. Of course, it goes all the way around from this point up until this point, that is the retina. So in the retina, we've got these two parts that we're going to focus on, which is the yellow spot and the blind spot, right? Now, let's come to this part. The part that I just drew there is what is known as the ciliary body. It is what is known as the ciliary body. So we've got the ciliary body at the bottom and the ciliary body at the top. Now within each and every ciliary body, we're going to find a muscle. And this muscle is what we refer to as the ciliary muscle. It is what we refer to as the ciliary muscle. Right. Now, after the ciliary muscles, we are going to have these things that look like ropes. And those are what are referred to as the suspensory ligaments. We refer to those as the suspensory ligaments. Those are the suspensory ligaments. From the suspensory ligaments, we've got this big disc right here, and this big disc is what is referred to as the lens. That is the lens. Now, in front of the lens, we've got this empty space that is made from the lower iris and the top iris. So in between the iris at the top and the iris at the bottom, we've got this empty space. Now, this empty space is what we refer to as the pupil. We call it the pupil, right? Now, in front of the pupil, we've got the empty space here, and this empty space is what is referred to as the aqueous humor. Let me rub this and write it again. We've got what is called the aqueous. Humor. Right. Now, these are all the parts that we are going to that will need to be able to label in the human eye. Is quite a lot of them. But we are not supposed to be limited to being able to only label them. We are supposed to know the functions of each and every part in this diagram. Right. Now, let's talk about the ability to see. When we see through light, right? So light has to enter. It has to enter the eye in order for us to see. But remember, we talked about the idea of refraction. When light enters the eye, it comes in different angles. And that's what I'm going to try to draw, right? Let's say this is the eye. And if light was to try to enter the eye, it will come in at different angles. But as this light comes in different angles, in the eye, this light is going to be refracted. Remember, when we say light is refracted, we are saying it is going to be able to pass through this object. But not only is it going to be able to pass through this object, it is going to change direction, right? So in the eye, what happens is, as light enters, it is going to be refracted. when it is refracted, it is going to be focused on the innermost layer of the eye. And the innermost layer of the eye is what we refer to as the retina. So, as light enters the eye, it is going to be refracted. Why is the light going to be refracted? So that it can be focused on the innermost layer of the eye that we call the retina, right? Now let's try to look at the path that is taken by the light as it enters the eye. Now, first of all, the light has to go through this outermost layer that we are going to refer to as the cornea. The cornea is the transparent part of the sclera, because remember, we said that the sclera is the outermost layer of the eye, but in front of the eye it becomes transparent. And this transparent part of the sclera is what we refer to as the cornea. So the cornea has to be transparent. Why must it be transparent? So that it can permit, so that it can allow this light to pass through. But remember, this is light coming from different directions. So it may be coming from downwards, from upwards, straight. It doesn't matter. But as soon as it comes to the cornea is transparent. Why is it transparent? Because it allows this light to pass through. But not only is the cornea transparent, it also refracts these light rays. And when light are refracted in the eye, they are going to be focused on the innermost layer of the eye that we call the retina. So there's going to be a refraction of light that occurs at the cornea. This is simply because the light has to be focused on the innermost layer, which is the retina. Now, after the cornea, we're going to come to this part that we refer to as the aqueous humor. Now, the aqueous humor also refracts light rays. Why does it refract light rays? So that they can be focused on the retina. After the aqueous humor, now comes the pupil. The pupil is simply an empty space that is made by the iris at the bottom and the iris at the top. So when light reaches the pupil, it is able to pass through immediately. But as soon as the light passes through the pupil, it is going to come into the lens. This is a disc that is called the lens. Now, what are the adaptations of the lens? Now, the lens is said to be transparent. Why is it transparent? Because it also permits light to pass through. But not only is the lens transparent, it also plays a role in the refraction of light. That is why its shape is described as being biconvex. This is simply because it refracts light rays. Why are the light rays refracted? So that they can be focused on the retina. So again, the light rays may come from different angles, but as soon as they reach the eye, they are going to be refracted. The angle of approach is going to change. Why is the angle being changed? So that the light can be focused on the retina. Right? So when the light passes through the lens, it is going to come to this part. And this is the part that we refer to as the vitreous humor. Now, the vitreous humor also plays a role in the refraction of light. Again, the reason why this light is being refracted is the same, that the light must be focused on the retina. Now, finally, this light is going to be able to reach the retina. The retina is the innermost layer of the eye. Now, let's try to explain why is it necessary for this light to be specifically focused on the retina. Why is it not focused on any other part of the eye? It is simply because this retina is said to be the light sensitive part of the eye. This is the light sensitive part of the eye. In the retina, this is where images are going to be produced, right? They are produced in the retina. This is where images are going to be produced. How are images produced in the retina? Now, the retina is said to have two different types of photoreceptors. Now, what does the word photo mean? The word photo simply means light. And we know that the function of each and every receptor is simply to convert a stimulus into a nerve impulse. And the name that we give to the receptor depends on the name of the stimulus in question. So when we say in the retina, there are receptors that are called the photoreceptors. We are simply saying these are receptors that are sensitive to light. So when these receptors are stimulated by light, they are going to convert that stimulus of light into a nerve impulse, right? So these are the type of receptors that are found on the retina. The type of receptors that are found on the retina, we call them photoreceptors, right? We call them photoreceptors. In the next slide, there's going to be notes explaining what I'm talking about or trying to write here. So don't worry about taking notes so much, rather listen, right? So in the retina, we've got photoreceptors, but these photoreceptors, we've got two different types of photoreceptors. We've got photoreceptors that are known as the rods, and we also have photoreceptors that are known as the cones, right? Now again, the rods and cones are types of photoreceptors. Where do we find photoreceptors? We find them in the retina. Why do we find these photoreceptors in the retina? Because the retina is the light sensitive part of the eye. What makes the retina sensitive to light is simply because the retina has those photoreceptors. These are the receptors that are sensitive to light, right? So in the retina, this is also where images are going to be formed. This is where images are produced. So in order for us to be able to see, the light that enters the eye must be able to reach this part that is called the retina. Now, how do the rods function as opposed to the cones? Now, the rods are said to be responsible for vision in dim light condition. When there is dim light, when there is very little light, then vision is going to be by means of the rods. But in bright light conditions, you are going to see through the receptors that are called the cones. So, the rods are responsible for vision in dim light, but the cones are responsible for vision in bright light, right? So when light reaches the retina, there's going to be these two types of receptors. Depending on the light conditions, one of the two receptors are going to be stimulated. Now, because these are receptors, their sole function is to convert the stimulus into nerve impulse, right? Now, what happens to the nerve impulse once it has been produced? The nerve impulse is going to be transmitted by the optic nerve from the photoreceptors to a specific part of the brain that we call the cerebrum. Now, one might ask, why does the nerve impulse need to be transmitted to the cerebrum? This is simply because the cerebrum receives and interprets all sensation. And sight, which is the ability to see, is a sensation. Therefore, the nerve impulses from the photoreceptors, they must be transmitted by the optic nerve to the cerebrum so that they can be interpreted and we are able to see. If no nerve impulses are transmitted to the cerebrum by the optic nerve, then we are not going to be able to see. We're going to be blind. There's not going to be any vision. Right. Now, we did say that the retina is made up of two parts that we have to cover. We've got this part that is called the yellow spot, and we also have another part that we refer to as the blind spot. Right. Now, how is this yellow spot different from the blind spot? Now, the yellow spot is said to have a very high concentration of cones. So there are a lot of those photoreceptors that we refer to as cones, but there are no rods. So in the yellow spot, there are strictly cones, but no rods. Now, we might remember that we said that cones are responsible for vision in bright light. So the yellow spot is therefore regarded to as the center of clearest vision. It is the center of clearest vision because it has got a very high concentration of cones without any rods. But when we come to the blind spot is said to not be sensitive to light. Why is it not sensitive to light? It is not sensitive to light because it has no photoreceptors. So in the blind spot, there are no rods, there are no cones. So if light rays were refracted and they were to fall on the blind spot, there will be no vision. You are going to be blind. Why are you going to be blind? Because the blind spot has no photoreceptors. It is not sensitive to light, right? So the stimulus of light here, it will not be converted into a nerve impulse. Therefore, you are not going to be able to see. You are going to be blind. In order for you to be able to see, in order for us to have the clearest vision, the light that is entering the eye, it must be refracted and it must be focused on the yellow spot. Because in the yellow spot, this is where we're going to have the highest concentration of cones without any rods. Again, the yellow spot is what we describe as the center of clearest vision. Now, Once the light rays reach the cones, since the cones are photoreceptors, these are receptors of light, they are going to convert that stimulus of light into a nerve impulse. That nerve impulse is going to be transmitted by the optic nerve from the cones, from the photoreceptors to the cerebrum of the brain. Again, why specifically to the cerebrum of the brain? Because the cerebrum receives and it interprets all sensations. Right? So this is what is going to happen to light before we are able to see. Now let's come back to the start. We know that in order for the light to be able to reach the retina, it must first pass through the cornea, the aqueous humor, the pupil, the lens, and the vitreous humor. So all the parts that are in front of the retina, they must be transparent. They must play a role in the refraction of light. So being transparent means they must allow this light to pass through so that it reaches the retina. They must also refract these light rays and focus them on the retina, because this is where images are formed. This is the light sensitive part of the eye. If the light rays do not fall on the retina, then no vision is going to occur. If they fall in front of the retina and not exactly on the retina, then that vision is going to be blurry, and we're going to discuss that later on. Right. So let's come back to the cornea. Now, the cornea, we said it is the front of the sclera, but the sclera in itself, it is said to be tough and it is said to be opaque. What does the word opaque mean? Opaque simply means it does not allow light to pass through. So the outermost layer around the entirety of the eye. Let me change colors. So when we talk about the sclera around the eye, it is going to be opaque. Why must it be opaque? So that light does not pass through. But in front of the eye, this cornea is transparent. So the sclera in front of the eye, it becomes a transparent disc that we refer to as the cornea. And it is necessary for this cornea to be transparent so that light is able to enter the eye. Because if light is unable to enter the eye, then it tells us that we are not going to be able to see. So one adaptation of the cornea is that it is transparent, and hence it permits light to enter the eye. Number 2, the shape of the cornea, it is said to be convex. Why is it convex? Because it refracts light rays, thereby focusing them on the retina. So the cornea has got 2 adaptations. Adaptation number 1, it is transparent. Why is it transparent? It permits light to enter the eye. Not only is it transparent, but it is also convex. That is the shape of the cornea. It is convex. Why is it convex? Because it refracts light rays, focusing them on the retina. So that is the cornea. In front of the cornea, we have got the aqueous humor. Now, the aqueous humor is said to also play a role in the refraction of light. So it helps to bend that light further so that it can be focused on the retina. But the aqueous humor also functions to maintain the shape of the cornea. You can see that the shape of the cornea in front of the eye, it has got a smooth curve. So this curve is maintained by the aqueous humor. Hence we say that the aqueous humor maintains the shape of the cornea. That is not the only function of the aqueous humor. It is also said to provide oxygen and nutrients to the lens and the cornea respectively. So the aqueous humor has got 2 major functions. Function number 1, it maintains the shape of the cornea. Function number 2, it provides oxygen and nutrients to the lens and the cornea respectively. Right. Now, let's come to this part that we call the iris. Now, the iris simply controls the size of the pupil. So this thing that we refer to as the pupil can change in size. It can either be big or it can be small. The shape of the pupil depends on whether the light conditions are bright or are dim. In dim light, where there's very little light, then the size of the pupil is going to be dilated. It is going to be very large. Why does it need to be big? So that more light is able to enter the eye. But when we are in bright light condition, the size of the pupil is going to decrease. So it is going to be smaller. So when we are looking at the eye, we've got the colored part of the eye. The black dot that is inside of the eye, the black dot is what we refer to as the pupil, right? So this pupil can change size. In bright light, it becomes very small. But in dim light, it is going to become very big. Why must it become very big in dim light? So that more light is able to enter the eye. But if we're in bright light conditions, then this pupil must become very small. Why must it become very small? So that very little light is able to enter the eye. Now one might ask, why is it necessary to regulate the amount of light that enters the eye? If a large amount of light enters the eye, it is going to damage the photoreceptors. And this may lead to blindness, because remember, we need the photoreceptors in order for them to convert the stimulus of light into nerve impulse, right? So the iris controls the size of the pupil. We are going to focus on this when we discuss pupillary mechanism. But what is important to note right now is that the iris can either go up or down and therefore change the size of the pupil, right? Behind the pupil, we've got the lens. Now, the adaptations of the lens is that number one, the lens is also transparent. Why is it transparent? Because it permits light to do what? To pass through. But not only is the lens transparent, it is also elastic. Why is it elastic? So that its shape can be altered, so that the shape of the lens can be changed. Why must the shape of the lens be changed? It must be changed so that we're able to see objects that are distant and objects that are near very clearly. And this is a process that is regarded to as accommodation. Again, we're going to focus on accommodation at a later stage. But in order for there to be the process of accommodation, the lens must be elastic. The shape of the lens must be able to be changed so that we can see objects that are distant and objects that are close very clearly, right? Not only is the lens transparent, and not only is it elastic, but it is also biconvex. When it is biconvex, it refracts light rays. Why does it refract light rays? So that they can also be focused on the retina. And then behind the lens, now we come to the vitreous humor. When we talk about the vitreous humor, it's a fluid that fills this large part of the eye right here. So its main function is that it maintains the round shape of the eyeball. That is the function of the vitreous humor. But since it is also in front of the retina, it must also play a role in the refraction of light rays. It must make sure that the light rays are bent so that they are focused on the retina. And that is a process that we refer to as refraction. Right. So after the light has been able to pass from the cornea, aqueous humor, the pupil, the lens, and the vitreous humor, that is when it will finally land on the innermost layer, which we call the retina. The retina, we've already said, it is the light sensitive part of the eye, and this is where images are going to be produced. Why is the retina light sensitive? Because it contains photoreceptors. How many types of photoreceptors do we have? We've got two. It is the rods and the cones. The rods, we said, they are responsible for vision in dim light conditions. The cones are responsible for vision in bright light conditions. So when they are stimulated, they are the ones that are going to convert the stimulus of light into nerve impulse. Once we have a nerve impulse, it is going to be transmitted by the optic nerve from the photoreceptors to the cerebrum of the brain. Why the cerebrum? Because it receives and interprets all sensations. So in order for us to be able to see, nerve impulses must be transmitted by the optic nerve from the photoreceptors to the cerebrum so that they can be interpreted. And that is how we're going to be able to see. But when we talk of the blind spot, which is immediately in front of the optic nerve, we said that the blind spot is not sensitive to light. And when we say it is not sensitive to light, we are simply saying in the blind spot, there are no photoreceptors, there are no rods, there are no cones, and as such, it is not sensitive to light. So if light rays were to focus on the blind spot, then this person is not going to be able to see, simply because in the blind spot, there are no photoreceptors. So the person is going to become blind, right? So let's focus on the outer structures now. Now we've got this structure that is referred to as the suspensory ligaments. Now the function of the suspensory ligaments is simply to hold the lens in position, right? So the main function of these suspensory ligaments, they hold the lens in position. Now, when we discuss accommodation, accommodation is a process that describes how the lens is going to change shape depending on whether the object that we are viewing is distant or it is near. So these suspensory ligaments, during accommodation, they will either become taut or they will become slack. And that is a topic we'll cover on another day. But their function for right now, it is simply to hold the lens in position, right? Now we come to the ciliary body. The ciliary body, we said, contains ciliary muscles. And these ciliary muscles also function during accommodation. Again, when we talk about accommodation, we're talking about a process that changes the shape of the lens for clear vision when you're viewing objects that are near or that are far. So we'll talk about the ciliary muscles and the ciliary body again when we focus on accommodation. Now, let's come to the middle layer of the eye that is referred to as the choroid. Now, the choroid has got two very important functions. Number one, the choroid is said to supply the entire eye with nutrients and oxygen. So this function is similar to the function of the aqueous humor. But the aqueous humor specifically provides nutrients and oxygen to the lens and the cornea. But the choroid provides nutrients and oxygen to the entire eye. So we say the choroid provides nutrients and oxygen to the eye, right? Number two, the choroid is said to contain what is called a brown pigment. Now, this brown pigment is very important because it prevents the reflection of light within the eye. So it is very important that the only process regarding light that occurs within the eye is refraction. If there was a reflection of light, it would bounce off from different parts and be focused on different parts that are not the retina. In that case, the vision that is going to be formed is going to be extremely blurry, right? So it is important to avoid the reflection of light within the eye, and that is done by the choroid because it has got this brown pigment that prevents the reflection of light within the eye, right? So all in all, these are the different parts of the eye that we must be able to label. These are the parts that we must be able to state the functions of. And we've got processes that we need to cover involving the amount of light that enters the eye, and we call that pupillary mechanism, and the changing of the shape of the lens, and we call that process accommodation, right? So let's continue. Now, what is written here? These are descriptions of what we were discussing on the previous slide. So you can just pause and copy it down if you need to or study, right? Let's continue to the next slide. The same story. You can pause. Next slide. Same story. You can pause. Next slide. Same story. You can pause. So that is an introduction to the eye. If you like what we've had to say, please consider subscribing and liking the channel. Until next time, bye-bye.